For many like myself, the 16-bit era is seen as the golden age of the JRPG. Some of the very best games ever made were released in this time, many of which still hold up to this day. This is thanks in part to their memorable characters, their absolutely legendary soundtracks, but arguably most importantly, their beautiful pixel art. It's been said a million times, but for good reason. Good pixel art doesn't really age. And if it does, it at the very least sure as hell ages a lot better than this. So when a game like Octopath Traveler was first unveiled, it immediately piqued my interest. The HD 2D art style, as Square has now dubbed it, struck me as pure genius. As we moved closer to launch, Square released a playable demo, and then months later released a second demo, both of which I did enjoy. However, they both raised questions and concerns about how the end product might end up. So, now that I finally have the full game, I've completed it, I've put more than 80 hours into it, is Octopath Traveler worth your hard-earned cash? And is it everything that I, and I'm sure you, wanted it to be? I'm Virgil for JRPG Central, and this is my review for Octopath Traveler. Before we go any further, I just want to let you know, as with any of my reviews, there will be no major spoilers in this video. Most of my footage will be from early stages in the game, and the parts that aren't were purposely chosen based on their lack of context. Now, on to the review. Octopath Traveler is divided equally in 8 parts between each of the protagonists. When you first start the game, you're asked to choose one of the 8 to become your quote-unquote main protagonist, though in the same way that Terra from Final Fantasy VI doesn't really remain the main protagonist, your first character you pick in Octopath is much the same. In fact, Octopath makes the bold choice of allowing you to play any story in any order you'd like. You could start with the dancer Primrose before picking up the scholar and best boy Cyrus, and slowly move through finding and recruiting the rest of the characters. Or you could start with the cleric Ophelia and play her story in its entirety without recruiting a single other character. Both are equally valid ways to play the game, and you can obviously do anything and everything in between. This kind of open design gave a great sense of freedom and uniqueness to my own playthrough, and really allowed me to play the game at my own pace. Each character has 4 chapters, meaning if my simple math is correct here, there are a total of 32 chapters in the game, with each chapter averaging between 1 to 2 hours long. I really loved how bite-sized and consumable the chapters were. This also translates to each character's overall arcs being very straightforward and consumable as well, which I see as a positive. I mean, it's basically a running gag at this point to say that your typical JRPG story involves a young group of teenagers trying to save the world, often with a main protagonist who is, at one point or another, any of these things. Octopath Traveler boldly kicks these trends with grounded, relatable characters that are almost all over 20 years old. And get this, you're not trying to save the world. Instead, you take on roles such as a bubbly traveling merchant trying to prove herself, or a huntress on a quest to find her dear master after he has gone missing. This more grounded approach to storytelling is something I really appreciated, and something I hope we see more often in the space. While I found every character's story arc enjoyable, the way they're structured can get kinda formulaic after a while. They all usually involve a conflict happening, some stuff happening in between, before being resolved with you going through a dungeon to face a boss. It also doesn't help that the dungeons that you go through are pretty basic too and feel kind of samey. Most of them take place in either a cave, a forest, or a castle, and can often be blazed through once you know what you're doing. But even with that in mind, I still really loved the stories. Each one is, for the most part, surprisingly well voice acted, and filled with genuinely memorable moments. You also meet many side characters unique to each character's storyline, and honestly, I was shocked by how well written some of these are. For what are, in the grand scheme of things, extra narrative fodder, I found myself really caring about some of them. Certain side characters like Leon, who you meet throughout Tressa's story, are almost as interesting as some of the main 8. These are all almost set up like 8 different mini JRPGs, and if you can accept that, there's a lot to love here. The only real flaw in this system is the characters' lack of true interaction with one another during each other's stories. There is true interaction outside of that, often great interaction, but the way Octopath handles the story chapters makes it to where once you start one, the character might as well be going through their story alone. To give you an example, early on in the game, I had decided that I would keep Cyrus in the front of my party because I liked his sprite and how he looked in front. However, while in the middle of Tressa's first chapter, I walked up to a cave to progress the story. And as I walked up with Cyrus, with the rest of the crew in tow, the game cut to Tressa walking up to the cave by herself. This was really jarring the first time it happened, and shows one of the weaknesses in formatting the story in this way. I will say a good way I found to mitigate these awkward transitions was to put whichever character whose story you're playing at that time in the lead. That way, when the transition happens, it's far more natural and doesn't take you out of the experience. So, if the characters don't interact with one another during each other's stories and cutscenes, where's the interaction? Well, the way the game chooses to solve this problem is through travel banter. Dialogue sequences that usually pop up right after a cutscene and always involves the character whose story you're playing and another character in your party. These are usually related to what just happened in the cutscene and give you deeper insight into how the main character, as well as the rest of your party, feels about what's going on. For many, this will seem like more of a band-aid than a proper solution, but with the way the game was designed, it simply could not have been as non-linear as it is, and still have interaction between characters during cutscenes. For this to be the case, the developers would have had to develop possibly hundreds of different scenarios with different characters, all depending on how far you were in the story, who you did and didn't have in your party at that time, and I just think it was either too much work for the team, or it simply wasn't in the budget. But if you can get past its quirks and suspend your disbelief in a few moments, I found this way of storytelling incredibly gratifying, and again, very consumable, which is perfect for a handheld home console hybrid like the Switch. Moving on to the gameplay, the combat in Octopath Traveler is very traditional, and will be particularly familiar to anybody who's played the Bravely Default series. Battles are turn-based, and yes, there are random encounters, but thanks to the break system, the battles are super fun and snappy. With the release of the 2 different demos, we got a unique look into how they developed this battle system. Originally, the break system was completely broken, no pun intended. You could easily abuse it to the point of literally, and I mean literally, not allowing your enemy to get a single turn in. Now, however, the break system is much more refined and not so broken. Every enemy has a certain amount of weaknesses indicated by the blue squares below their sprites, with a small numbered shield next to it indicating their armor. You can figure out these weaknesses either by using certain skills like Analyze, or through trial and error through different attacks. This part of battle reminded me a lot of Persona 3, especially with all the different physical attack types at your disposal. Cycling through each party member's specific skills to try and figure out the enemy's weakness is almost therapeutic. Hitting an enemy with something they're weak to will take away a point of their armor, and completely destroying their armor will cause a break, accentuated by the sound of glass shattering followed by a dramatic slow-mo effect. This causes the enemy to skip their next turn and take much more damage until they recover. The build-up to a break reminds me a lot of the stagger mechanic from Final Fantasy XIII in the best kind of way. Every turn you get a battle point or BP. Using BP allows you to either attack times equal to the amount of BP consumed, or power up your skills and abilities for more advanced versions. This, coupled with the break system, makes for some truly fun strategic battles. At its core, Octopath's combat is all about managing these battle points. Do you save and stack your BP to unleash powerful attacks once your enemy is broken? Or do you spend that BP to break your opponent before they unleash a powerful attack of their own? It's an engaging system, and one that will be a welcome addition to anyone who's played the classic, albeit simpler games that Octopath is so heavily inspired by. Each character represents 8 different classes or jobs that will be recognizable to anyone who's played an RPG before. Ulbrich is your warrior, Therion is your thief, and so on and so forth. Picking the right team for a given situation is of course part of what makes job systems like these so enjoyable. Every character has weapons and abilities that are unique to them, making every character play a little differently than the other. Just as combat was beginning to get a bit stale though, I happened upon my first job shrine. These unlock the ability to equip a second job to any of your characters. In total, there are 12 shrines hidden throughout Ostera, each one granting you the ability to equip one of the primary 8 jobs, as well as 4 more powerful hidden jobs, to a member of your party as a secondary job. Of course, after finding the first one, it'll be up to you to find the rest. Luckily, they aren't too hard to find and are usually not far from where you first met the job's corresponding character. You could have a thief cleric or a scholar hunter. There are a ton of ways you can customize your party. Continuously finding synergy between certain jobs to create devastating combinations for use during battle is a large part of what kept me hooked for over 80 hours. The job-specific abilities you learn can only be used while you have that job equipped. Learning these abilities, however, unlocks passive skills that can be equipped regardless of the job you're using. For instance, the merchant has a support skill called SP Saver that halves the amount of SP it costs to use skills or magic. This is something that would obviously be nice to have on everybody, so the game kind of incentivizes you to experiment and try every job on every character, and rewards you for doing so. Plus, the goal of maxing out every character with every class is a fun challenge to work towards once you reach the postgame. Speaking of postgame, if content is your concern, there is a fair amount of stuff to do once you've beaten all 8 stories. There are, of course, many side quests left to do unless you're an absolute madman and finish them first. But even then, I believe there are new side quests that only appear after completing certain parts of the story, some of which are really interesting. One I remember in particular involved the side character Odette from Cyrus's story. At the very beginning of the side quest, you come to find out that she knows and has history with Ravello, a man who was very close friends with Primrose's father. This interaction kind of blew me away. I found it to be such a neat way of handling world building, and it made Ostera feel more real, more lived in, like it had a real history to it. There is also a final secret boss, with a number of side quests that lead up to it. I obviously won't spoil anything here, but this is where all of the stories kind of get tied together. Like much of the story in the rest of the game though, this tying together is done in a much more low-key way. I can't review Octopath Traveler without mentioning the game's art style, which, as I said before, is what caught my eye in the first place, and I'm sure it's probably what caught many people's eyes to begin with. And I have to commend the team for pulling off this look as well as they did. The HD 2D art style, as the name implies, combines stylistic elements of both the classic 2D JRPGs of the 90s with modern HD post-processing effects like real-time lighting and depth of field. For the most part, this works to a stunningly effective degree. While the environments are all made up of 3D objects, they all have a distinct pixelated 2D look to them. It manages to look amazing with all of these enhancements, yet still kind of look like an actual 16-bit game. It's surreal and honestly a little difficult to put into words properly. However, while these effects do a lot for the presentation, they can sometimes work against it. At times, overuse of effects like depth of field can make it kind of hard to take in the beautiful environments. And the game's greatest sin in this area is that the entire game has this vignette effect darkening the corners of the screen at all times. It made exploration feel claustrophobic and was my biggest gripe from the very first build of the game. This is clearly an artistic choice, and some people might like it, but I personally can't stand it, and I know that there are a lot of other people who also did not like it when the first demos dropped. Luckily, you can fix this by turning off corner shadows in the settings menu. However, doing so creates another problem. It seems that this setting not only disables the shadows, but it also increases the exposure of the entire screen, making everything look too bright and washed out. The solution I found was to turn off the corner shadows, but also turn down the in-game brightness all the way. This gives what I believe to be the best possible picture, and all the gameplay you've seen on screen was captured with these settings on. The exploration in Octopath is a little different from your traditional JRPG, and is honestly a lot closer to a more modern JRPG. Instead of having a proper overworld, Octopath's world is presented with its towns and cities being connected by multiple interwoven roads, often with treasures hidden slightly off the beaten path. The towns and locations you'll come across are all very well designed and diverse. You'll come across bustling trade cities, quiet snowy villages, and shady desert towns. And all of these locations, and in fact all parts of Octopath Traveler, are accompanied by an absurdly good soundtrack. It cannot be understated how absolutely stellar the composition in this game is. Composer Yasunori Nishiki is relatively new to the high-profile video game composing scene, with this being his first large-scale project of this size. I hyped him up when I first talked about the demo almost a year ago, and now having heard the rest of the game's score, I can tell you it was for good reason. Every single track in this game triumphantly achieves the emotional response it looks to evoke from the player. Whether it's tracks like My Quiet Forest Home hitting you with a wave of melancholy nostalgia, or Decisive Battle 2 getting you absolutely hyped for a boss battle, no track feels out of place. The music in Octopath Traveler is some of the best I've heard in years, and is already quickly becoming one of my all-time favorite JRPG soundtracks. While it certainly has its shortcomings, Octopath Traveler is a solid JRPG. Its unique take on storytelling with its bite-sized story structure is a breath of fresh air for a genre that is, if we're honest, not necessarily known for its brevity. It's got a great cast of characters, an addictive battle system, and tracks you'll be listening to long after you've moved on from the game. If the massive success and sales for this game are any indication, hopefully we get more games of this quality from Square in the not-so-distant future. If you're an old-school JRPG fan who owns a Nintendo Switch, you'd be doing yourself an absolute disservice to skip out on Octopath Traveler.